Okay, welcome to another episode, the fourth of Going South, the podcast based here in the Deep South. I'm really excited and fortunate to have a guest on that I've been wanting to talk to. Her name is Dr. AJ Ramirez. She is a lecturer in sociology at Valdosta State University. Her areas of expertise are sexism, gender discrimination, gender issues in general, racism, LGBTQ issues. She also does work on educational reform. She teaches classes on race, class, and gender, social problems, introductory sociology, medical sociology, global feminism, queer feminist theory, and feminist theory, and LGBT studies. So we've got a lot to talk about. She's been kind enough to make a little room before the holidays start to chat today. So AJ, I really appreciate it. And if I got any of that wrong, please feel free to correct me.
No, I was right on. Thank you, Mark.
No worries. One of the reasons, and we talked about this, I wanted to have you on, is that you're the first woman I've had on. You're the first gay person I've had on. And you're a fairly devout Christian to some degree, from what I understand. So I figured we had a lot. I just had a old roommate of mine on, who we were both going into seminary, and he went from being a Methodist minister to a pretty devout atheist. And lo and behold, he was an atheist when he was a minister. So we had a whole conversation about that recently. So it's great to have a different perspective about Christianity and the Christian faith, and kind of what that means to you, both as a woman and as a gay person.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
thank you.
Yeah. So you're not a South Georgia native? Are you from North Georgia?
So yeah, sort of. Yeah. So I was born in Texas in San Antonio,
Okay.
and I spent the first 8 years of my life there in San Antonio with my mom and dad and my younger brother. And then we relocated to North Georgia when I was 8.
Okay.
In
Military or?
No, my parents were a Mexican American working class family. So we were just another job, a better job opportunity kind of presented itself for my father. And my father being the Mexican side and my mother being the white side, her family was from the Georgia, North Carolina area. So she had some connections. And so we moved up in the uh, Habersham County area up in North Georgia. And that's actually where I was educated with the rest of my elementary years, middle and high school years.
Gotcha.
So I guess I am a Georgian now,
I
but
got you.
my roots are very Texas.
Yeah. Do you identify as Latina too, or?
Well, I identify as Mexican American, so there is some political difference with Mexican American and Chicano. I think now we it's more of integrated as opposed as it was maybe back in the 80s. But Mexican American, yeah,
Yeah.
very American, but still Mexican.
Yeah. Gotcha. So was your family religious from the get-go, or was that something that
Yes.
came on later?
Yes, very religious. So my father was raised Catholic and went to Catholic school in Texas. His parents were both. His father was Mexican American, but his mother was from Mexico, and very devout Catholic. My grandfather was Catholic, but then he converted to Christian Science. Um, but my father was raised Catholic, and then my mother and her family were very evangelical, and she was raised in the Holiness Church
Uh,
in South Carolina and Georgia. So she was raised in a much more charismatic environment than Catholicism. But when they came together, they found some common ground in a kind of very conservative but yet low temperance type of Baptist church in South Texas. And
wow.
that's kind of where I started my religious kind of understanding and education, was in a very small Texas Baptist church.
Wow. Was it
Yeah.
a Southern Baptist, or because there's many
Um,
different flavors of Baptist, right?
Yeah, there are so many, right, different types of Baptist, and I would probably say probably Southern Baptist would probably be the most accurate if I had. I don't know much about the different sects of the Baptist denomination, but I know it was called Hot Wells Baptist Church because it was on Hotwell Street, and so that's where we went, and that's where I was baptized when I was 6, and um, but we didn't stay with the Baptist church. You know, that changed when we actually moved to Georgia. Georgia had a church and a cemetery around every corner.
Yeah.
And in Texas, it wasn't like that. There was a few churches here and there in the 80s, but it wasn't like you go down, a mile, there's another church, and a
Right.
mile down this way, there's another church.
They call it the Bible Belt for a reason, right?
Right. And cemeteries were separate. Like there was not a cemetery behind the church. We were a little culture shocked when we came to Georgia, and my father was like, "What's the deal with the cemeteries behind the churches?"
So what denomination did you all find yourself in when you came to Georgia?
Well, so we kind of took a leave of absence from traditional bureaucratic church. My parents actually found them very offensive. When they moved to Georgia, there was a little bit of a change to their relationship. So in Texas, it's a little more accepted to have a Mexican man married to a white woman. And so that they encountered a little of some racism based on their relationship when we moved. And so I remember my friends being screened before I could actually be friends with them, because they wanted to make sure that there wasn't going to be any sort of issue with
Wow.
a child being friends with a mixed child. And so some of the churches that my parents tried out, we quickly left. So we kind of hopped around for a few years, and then we started going to these things called tent
Oh
revivals,
yeah, I've been to a
and
tent
they're
too.
kind of neat.
Yeah.
The people put up these big tarp tents,
Yeah.
right? It's almost like it's like tailgating, but with Jesus.
Yeah.
and and we would travel to the Westminster, South Carolina area where my great grandmother was still living, who was extremely religious, holiness, wore the dresses, had the long hair, no makeup, very, very, primitive, right? And so she would invite us to come up, and we would spend Saturdays. They worshiped on Saturday. We'd probably get there around, I'd say about 11 o'clock, and we'd probably leave around 4. And so we would do this maybe 2 or 3 times a year. And that was kind of church, that was enough. And that's kind of where I was kind of introduced to things that I wasn't introduced in the Baptist church in Texas, because it was very more low key. You had the organ, you had the
Right.
people in the hymnal outfits singing from the books. This was more of a very diverse environment, mainly African American,
Wow.
with spotted white folks. And it was all outside, and people had their paper fans, and there was no air condition, and there was mosquitoes, and it was people really speaking in tongues and anointing with oil and dancing in what they would say in this Holy Ghost spirit.
Gotcha.
And that's I kind of did that till I was about, well, we went to those till I went off to college. But
Oh,
I started attending a United Methodist church when I was 15 with some of my friends from high school, and then that was kind of the denomination I felt the most connected to.
gotcha. If I and please don't feel any pressure to answer anything that you don't want to. But how was the family with interracial marriage, particularly your mom's side? My experience with folks, especially my ex is from San Antonio, is that folks of
Oh,
color
cool.
are much more receptive to interracial relationships than some white folks. Or was that ever a problem for your folks in the family?
So my mom's family, no, they were so welcoming of my father and his family. And we didn't have any racial issues from the family, not on my mom's side, but we mainly encountered those racial issues from the community. Mhm.
Around you? Gotcha. Gotcha.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Only in Georgia. We really didn't experience that in the San Antonio area. We didn't have that problem. If there was a racial issue, from what I've been told by my parents, it was before my mom and dad got married, and it was from the Mexican side. They were a little concerned
Right.
about my dad marrying a white girl.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Probably for different reasons
Yeah.
than the white folks
Yeah,
did,
yeah.
you know. Yeah. Yeah, so you make the transition to United Methodist around 15. Um,
Hmm.
did you stay in that till current
I
day?
did.
Yeah.
I did. I
And
currently attend the United Methodist Church now, and it was just a really good balance. Um, it was a lot more tame. Not that I was against I respected the holiness approach, their dancing and speaking in tongues and the anointing and their excitement about God and Christ. That was not a problem for me. The ancient hymns that they would just sing from memory were absolutely beautiful. I almost feel like my love for archaeology and sociology started in those days in those tent revivals. But some of the issues I started to find was as I was developing into my own being and I discovered my sexual orientation and my gender was not lining up with the rules that the holiness denomination was saying was the only way.
right,
And so I started to do a little digging biblically and doing some research outside with biblical studies and found that there wasn't real consistency with what they were saying with biblical text. It was
right,
more of how one was perceiving and interpreting it. So
right.
I didn't want to disrespect my family. So I just said, I still believe in God, but I think I'm good. There's so many denominations. Let me just find something different.
Yeah. So how was
Yeah.
again? At what point was it tough coming out to your family since they were religious, or were they pretty accepting? And then what was that like, kind of finding your faith too, in a
Yeah.
way that would
So
accept who you are as a gay
So I
woman?
didn't come out to them till I was a grown adult and already with my current wife.
Okay.
So they, my first relationship was they closeted and there was no, I mean, I lived, in the closet, what I call lived a lie, but I felt I was forced into it. And, so I didn't come out, but what I did was I kind of internalized that stuff and made sense of it and try to find that piece of because there was a time where I had to make a decision. Do I walk away from my faith because I'm hearing from a majority of Christian denominations that being gay is not okay? And so it just took me really meditating and praying and like I said, Mark, I had to do some real research. I had to kind of self-teach myself Greek and Hebrew and with certain phrases and verses and getting contextual understanding and this was before Google, right? So
Yeah,
you
yeah, yeah,
you're really having to do encyclopedia. You're going to the library, right? We're actually kind of pulling out books
yeah.
and
Exegesis
and
and
so
yeah, yeah,
and finding different versions of the Bible and trying to understand how can you have different versions and is that
right,
okay? And
right,
um, so a lot of those things, it took time for me to make that peace, and I did. I chose in that walk that my faith was my foundation, and I felt that humans had put so much of their own input into what and how things should be. And I didn't even know the canonization at the time, but I found that out in those years in high school, and that helped me understand that I think they've messed some things up here.
yeah, yeah,
So I feel very confident that my faith was intact and that maybe in my life I could find opportunities to help educate my brethren, my brothers and sisters in Christ and the church, that there are some aspects to gender and sexual orientation that are irrelevant to our relationship with God.
yeah,
Those are so physical and so surface and so dominated by culture and society. They have very little to do with the spiritual relationship that we have with God.
yeah. Well, Jesus didn't have a whole lot to say about sexuality, you know.
I don't think he had anything
He,
really
he
to say
really
about
didn't.
it.
Not that I've seen anyway. So it's always been fascinating
Um,
what the way people will use scripture to justify a position they often already have. You know, well, I kind of connected to this though. I mean, do you identify as feminist?
yes, I do
Yeah.
identify as a
So
feminist.
how, if we can talk a little bit about coming out of a tradition where there's a patriarchal God, the Methodist Church, from what my old roommate was a Methodist minister, and I think they were both the first ordained women as well as folks of color Um, how did you did you have to work through kind of how Christianity is gendered and typically very patriarchal, where you have an unlimited God that's limited to a male gender, where roles are rigidly defined in a lot of denominations? Was that also a process?
It was a process. And part of that process for me was the individuals who canonized the biblical text and made those choices, and the monarchs and all of those, Martin Luther and,
Who are all
John
men.
Wesley. All, yes, exactly. So when I looked at it from a cultural and a historical, standpoint, I started to read the sacred text more on the lines of, I need to respect this for the time that it was written and the rules that were appropriate for society at this time. And when I was able to accept that lens, a peace came over me in living in, at the time, 1996 or whatever time period it was, that what the life I'm living today reflects very little of what was okay then. And not just the life that I'm living,
Yeah.
but the pastors and the elders that are telling me that I'm not okay, the life they're living looks very different than what those individuals did. So kind of creating that understanding for me as I've grown into the person I am and the feminist I identify as. I don't look, how do I say this? The rules that the church has placed, I don't necessarily value. I can respect to a certain degree, but if I see inaccuracies based on historical lens or culture, then I bring that out and I say, I think it would be a shame if we don't take these things into consideration.
Yeah.
It's an injustice to not just people on the spectrum, like, who, in the LGBTQ community, but it's a disservice to many people. And so, I mean, we'll just make it simple. Women played such a huge role,
Right.
right, with the discipleship of Christ and Christianity, but they are so left out. And not just left out, but demonized, right? And fingers pointed at a lot of women for things that they've done, were responsible for the sin of man,
Well,
right?
that's huge, and I don't want us to kind of brush past that one. I think there's a way. I mean, that's kind of one of the core things about feminist theology, right? This blaming our situation on Eve. That these patriarchs that put this together, that were divinely inspired, really blamed women for the fall of humanity.
Yeah.
I mean, is that fair to say?
I mean, yeah, it's fair to say that it's stated like that currently from the patriarchal standpoint. Yes, yes. I don't necessarily think Christianity is supposed to be based on a patriarchal standpoint. I don't necessarily think it's supposed to be based on a matriarchal standpoint. I think it's just supposed to be based on love and compassion and forgiveness and understanding and all of those great fruits of the spirit that talks about, in the book of Galatians. And I think that is the focal point, not societal measures of what worth is. And that's what I feel like it's become so bureaucratic and so capitalistic in nature with the competitiveness and and that goes into all these other things with big mega churches and membership dues and tithing. What are we doing here, right? And that's been my revelation of making peace with being a Christian versus being a religious churchgoer.
Right. Right. Those are two different things in a lot of ways, right?
For me, yes.
Yeah. So I'm just curious about this. Did you ever think about the ministry?
Oh gosh, yes, I did. I did. So yeah, so when I graduated, me and Carl Hand had a conversation about this. When I graduated
Yeah, he
high
was
school,
almost a
I went
priest, I
to a
think, right?
I know,
I
right?
think
We
he was.
talked about this.
Yeah.
Got to get him on the show.
Yeah. Yeah.
When I graduated high school, I went to a military school called North Georgia College and State University. It's located in Dahlonega,
I had a
Georgia.
friend that
It's
went there.
now the University of North
Right.
Georgia. They've grown. Yeah, so I was a cadet. I joined in as a cadet, um, and I wanted to be an Army chaplain. So that's what I
Wow.
wanted to do. And I was in the chaplain corps, and I was also in the military band while I was a student there. And they're a problem entailed because after I graduated,
And
you
are you
cannot
still
commit.
closeted at this point?
Yes, I'm still
Okay.
closeted. In
Okay.
fact, I'm not just closeted, I'm still questioning.
I got you.
I haven't even really, I've already had one full relationship by this point with a woman, a 3-year intimate relationship. And even through all of that, I was, we didn't use these words then, but I was more of a non-binary almost kind of person. I just didn't see the gender or the sex of the individual. I was just in love with that person, and it just happened to be a woman. So at this point, I'm still questioning, what does that mean? And we're in like maybe 2001, 2002 right now.
Gotcha.
So I wanted to be an Army chaplain, but you can't become a chaplain with a bachelor's degree. You have to have a master's of divinity.
Okay.
So the training you do at the senior military college, there's no point in commissioning because you got to go to seminary, and then you got to do a direct commission into the military if you want to do that. So I did look into that, and I ran into a barrier. I wanted to go to Asbury Seminary,
Yeah,
which
it's
is
Methodist. Yeah.
that's right, right?
Yeah.
And there were things you had to kind of state early on that you were not going to participate in to proceed forward with
Gotcha.
this. And one of them was, no intoxication, no premarital sex.
Right.
Those things were fine for me. And then one was you had to be on board with the homosexuality is an abomination to God. That was
Right.
kind of one of the parts of the process. And
Yeah.
even though I was still questioning, something felt very wrong about that. Very, not just within myself innately, but something felt very, very wrong about that being correlated with a seminary.
Yeah.
A place where one is supposed to learn to be a teacher of the scriptures,
Right.
a mentor, a counselor, a guide. So I couldn't
Yeah.
sign it. It felt very inauthentic.
Yeah, back in the day, Asbury was kind of conservative.
Mhm.
I don't know if they still are, but I had friends that went and attended seminary there, and we disagreed on a lot of things, but I just remember it being more conservative. Did
Yeah,
you ever enlist in the military?
I did not. No,
Didn't?
I was
Yeah.
just a cadet. Hmm.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know how it was when you were there, but my buddy went to Dahlonega, North Georgia College, and it was pretty hardcore back in the day.
Oh no, it was very hardcore. When I went, it was very hardcore.
Yeah,
Yes,
he
indeed.
told me stories,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
know,
Well, it was. Mhm.
because everybody was really preparing to enlist, either as officers or just enlisted folks. So yeah, so
Yeah, it's
where
very,
do we?
very good. It's a good training school if you plan on being in the military.
Yeah, with let me ask you this, because I know in my own kind of sexual life, religion really got in the way. I grew up fundamentalist. I was a missionary briefly for the Southern Baptist Convention, and there was no way to talk about sexuality at all. And there were times where I thought I was this evil person because I had these desires. And I'm wondering, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. Yeah, I lost your picture. I'm wondering if you encountered that too, I guess.
Repeat that last part again. If I
Yeah,
encountered which.
I remember going through puberty and thinking I was inherently evil for the thoughts and feelings I was having, and basically was told that in my faith tradition. There was nowhere to turn to talk about it. And I really internalized that the devil was in me. And I was a terrible, terrible person for having these feelings and everything that comes along with that. I'm just wondering, was that ever a struggle as you were figuring out your sexuality, or?
It was. I mean, I never, so the issue I had was I was a very, I guess, different type of high school adolescent. I didn't do a lot of the things that my peers did. I kind of missed that boat of the drinking and the promiscuity and the experimenting with drugs. I never did that. And so part of my experience in high school is probably very different than most. I was looked at as kind of a goody goody kind of in a way, but I was a closeted, obviously gay person that nobody really knew.
If they only
Um,
knew, right?
right. So I knew this is where I guess it's a little different for me. In my heart, I genuinely loved being a Christian. And I didn't love being a Christian because I was going to church, because we didn't go to church. I loved being a Christian because I loved developing this very supernatural, faith-based type of relationship with this higher power that was all about love. And I thought this was so cool and so amazing. And this unconditional love that this higher power can give to people like us who are so flawed, I was just wowed by it. And so when I did start to go through that puberty stage, um, after I became a Christian, because even though I was baptized at 6, I didn't really accept God till around 14, 15 years old. And so puberty had started for me I was female, so about 10 or 11, okay, a little bit earlier than guys. And so when sex kind of started to come up in high school, I wasn't interested in hookup sex. I
Yeah,
wasn't
yeah, yeah.
interested
Right.
in just the experimental sex. So that stuff was very off-taking for me. But when I started my relationship with the woman that I first had the relationship with, we grew very intimate where obviously sexuality did occur.
Right.
And there was a time right at the beginning of that, because I was a virgin, I'd never had a
Right.
sexual experience like that, where I did have some guilt because I was thinking, this should be for marriage. So
Mm.
it wasn't that I was battling with this idea of this is a woman as much as I was battling with I'm not married. And so
Yeah.
that's very unique in how I was processing
Yeah.
that as an adolescent. Um, but I did start to, because she also identified as a Christian and came from a very conservative home. There was this type of conversations that we would have early on, like, is this okay? Should we be doing this? Are we going to go to hell? I remember
Yeah.
that being a
Yeah.
conversation one time. Um, but we quickly said, no, I don't think so, because it doesn't feel wrong when I'm with you. It only feels wrong when I start thinking about how other people in the church will think about it.
You were so much
And I
more
don't know,
mature. You were so much
I
more
guess
mature than me. I
so.
couldn't
I
make
guess
that kind of distinction. Like, oh my God.
well, I mean, it was like I said, I was an odd adolescent, I guess. But anyway, so that was a big part of my process. So I did have those questions, but it wasn't really about, it was more about, am I more worried about the perception of others versus who I am authentically?
Yeah. So you had no doubt about your goodness and commitment, to your, yeah,
Well, I wasn't a saint, but yeah, I felt like I
man,
was on a pretty good path, as
man,
far as making good choices,
yeah,
finish school, make good grades,
yeah,
take care of your family, those types of things were instilled from my mom and dad. And my mother was not okay with homosexuality, but she was very good at asking me if I had questions about sex, or she was really good at that. She was really good at when I was in middle school, sitting me down and kind of saying, I know you're going to start hearing things. You may have already started hearing them, but I want you to hear it from me first. If you have questions, let me explain it to you. We can go to the library, we can,
yeah,
you know, look at pictures and books, but I really would want you to be educated. So I have to give her some credit that she was a good mom.
yeah. Well, I think also again, context is everything, right? But you said you did get the message that being gay was not really acceptable.
Right. No, not at all.
Was that
Not at all.
overt, or was that
And it,
just kind of in comments that were made indirectly, or
no, it was overt. My mother did tell me that, you know, sex was for marriage and it was between a man and a woman. And I was too young to be married, so I didn't need to be having sex now.
Right.
But if I did need to have sex or something like that, we needed to talk about it, and I needed to get on birth control and get a condom or something like that, which I knew was a stretch for her with her faith. But she said being a lesbian is out of the question. Like, I mean, she said it like verbatim. You can never, ever be gay. And she had that conversation with me when I was 13. And I'll be honest with you, Mark, when I was 13, I didn't know what gay meant. So I even asked her, I says, what is gay? And she said, that is terrible. It's a terrible,
Wow.
evil thing where people of the same sex lust after each other in a very unhealthy, ungodly way.
Yeah.
That's how it was
That was
described.
where I was kind of go. Like, I was also wondering if she had suspected anything, especially if you're not playing the gender game the way you're kind of supposed to, because those two get conflated, right? A lot of
Absolutely.
times for
Yeah.
parents, right?
I asked her after I came out as an adult, I was like, Mom, you had to have known. And she said,
What?
she says, I never did.
Yeah. Wow. Wow.
So I mean, and she doesn't lie. So
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
I absolutely a believer if she says she never did.
Yeah.
She
Was
thought
your
I was just a tomboy.
Yeah. 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 Right. Was your dad cool through all this?
My dad just let my mom handle raising the kids.
I got you. So
Yeah,
kind
he
of
was just
traditional gender
mhm.
norms where that's her.
I mean, he coached us in sports and he was at every event and he would take us to school. I mean, he did a lot of stuff, but when it came to just the rules of parenting, he really kind of defaulted to mom.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So, as a Methodist, I mean, do you believe in a supernatural God? Do you believe in heaven and hell?
Mhm.
Like, where is all of that these
So
days?
semantics, I think, just really screw with people sometimes. I've heard people say, don't use the word hell, don't use the word heaven. So, I mean, I'm comfortable using those words, but I'm also comfortable just not. To me, the words doesn't matter. It's what we're talking about that matters. So I do believe that there is an eternity of life. And in that life, you spend that life with God. Okay. You spend that life peaceful and no
In our
suffering.
current form or in a different form? I mean, what do you think?
No, no, I think no, this form I think goes away. It dies off, it's fleshy, it gets old, decays,
Yeah,
and then
yeah.
your
I can
soul
look
and
in
your
them. I see
spirit.
that every day when I look in the mirror.
You look great, Mark. Um, and so I see that step of eternal life through your authentic self going forward, your soul. And then I see the absence of that, which is what people refer to as hell, or in the biblical text, Sheol, which translates into death. So the end of something where it ceases. So for me, it's this sense of, do you go forward with peace or does it end? And you kind of stop at the unrest and the lack of peace that you obtained while still here. There is no closure.
Is that
And
determined by what we do here for you, how we
for
live?
Well, partially, but all of my faith is wrapped up in salvation through Christ. So for me, it's all about this sense of living a life that reflects the individual that you've accepted as holy. So for me, that's Jesus Christ. I believe he is, the Son of God and he is God. And so for me, by accepting the fact that he came here, God kind of put aside his power and glory and came kind of in our presence, kind of what we have, and went through the things we go through and did it blamelessly and then died a death awful. There is this sense of great power. This supernatural existence occurred where that sacrificial moment atoned all the flaws that I would entail in my life. But in order to get that, I have to believe in it. I have to believe in something that I've never seen, that I'll never see. I have to buy into the fact through faith that that is absolute truth. And when I do that, I cross over into this spiritual experience that atones me for the things I've committed. But from that moment forward of that acceptance, I'm making a choice that I'm going to live a life that reflects what this individual did, loved, forgave, was compassionate, was patient, was understanding. It's through those tools that I can continue to live a life of goodness and hopefully have peace.
Original sin?
Like what the
Well, I
sin,
mean, do you think we're kind of born flawed? Like,
I don't.
yeah, yeah. I mean,
I
because
actually
it's
don't.
kind of huge, right? Because the salvation story in my tradition is we're all pretty inherently kind of evil. God becomes carnate in the form of the Christ, right? Who then pays for our evilness and sins. And then our job is to kind of accept that sacrifice in order to avoid eternal hell, right? And that's all because we're just set up inherently as evil. This is one of those things that always confused me, right? And when we talk about racial justice, it always confused me. Like when white folks say, well, I didn't own any slaves, I didn't do this, but those same white folks think we're all bad because of what happened at the beginning of time. That
That's a
we're
good point.
responsible for what Adam and Eve did, but
Right.
I don't want to talk about my granddad, right?
Very good
So,
point. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that, so in the sense of traditional interpretations of original sin, you don't adhere to that. And do you think Jesus was a real person? Like, do you really,
I
or
do.
is it a myth or?
No, no, I absolutely believe he was an absolute real person and that he was murdered.
Hmm.
And he was murdered unjustifiably. He was innocent and was murdered. And so I think that the original sin thing, I don't think we're born evil or incarnate, to this sense of selfishness. I mean, when I saw the birth of my son and watching him grow up here in the last 21 months, he is so flawless. I mean, the mistakes he makes are just
Yeah,
out of ignorance and lack of education. I mean, it's not, and it's because he has to be socialized,
he's
right?
just babying too. That's what he does.
Yeah, I mean, I'm literally teaching him things that are not innate, right? We
Right,
just don't do those things.
right.
So, yeah, I don't believe in that original sin stuff. I think that that sets people up to have fear, and I don't believe Christianity is about fear.
Yeah,
There is no, you don't scare the hell out of somebody. That's not how salvation works. It's a choice. It's your will, it's free will to choose to believe into something that is great, full of love. The theology that comes in that teaches people that we have to put in this fear of this place called hell where gnashing of teeth and it's brimstone and fire and torturous. If that's how you have to get someone to live a life where they believe in something that's supposed to be about love, that seems all wrong. That
yeah,
just doesn't make
yeah.
sense. And so I feel like a lot of churches try to force this idea through fear to try to get people, quote unquote, converted. And that's not a true conversion. It's a surface flaw. It's kind of like when I'm doing psychotherapy, it's treating the symptom instead of listening to the context and understanding the foundation of what's going
Yeah.
on.
I always thought it was a great paradigm of domestic violence too, that you have this male figure that if I don't who created me, who has all power over me, who's always watching me, knows my inner thoughts. And if I don't love that male patriarchal figure, I will be punished forever. This kind of conditional love,
Yeah.
and it just seems like a small notion of what God would be like. So God created me so I could just, you know, love him or not, kind of thing.
Right.
And I
Right.
don't mean to belittle that, but I am
No.
serious that it does mirror domestic violence situations where men have had power and control over women and will literally destroy women, their families, their children, if they can't possess them, if they don't have all power over them. So
Yeah.
I've always struggled with that one myself. We started talking a little while ago about, I mentioned to you on the phone call before we got going, evangelicalism,
Mhm.
because I asked you if you were evangelical, and you said you weren't, and I'm just kind of, the other thing that's happened connected to evangelicalism in my lifetime, I've watched evangelicals become politicized. When I was in church as a kid, again in fundamentalist Southern Baptist, politics, you didn't talk about who was running for office. In fact, your nonprofit status limited that. Preachers just didn't. And I would argue, with Pat Robertson, Jerry Falwell, the moral majority, there's a way that Christianity has been weaponized and politicized, and a lot of folks really want a theocracy. I've been grappling with the reality that my brothers and sisters here in my faith tradition elected, who are Southerners, who aren't really down with divorce, promiscuity, infidelity, don't really like Yankees. The majority of them voted for a guy born into wealth who got a small loan for $1 million, who has cheated on wives, multiply divorced, has had illicit affairs with porn stars, who bragged about sexually assaulting women, who is clearly about money and this world.
Yeah.
Like, how people made sense out of making that choice that goes against everything in my faith tradition and everything I was taught.
Yeah.
So when I say evangelical, what does that mean to you?
Well, it means two different things. Like when I was a child, like for you, it was very different. Evangelism in a lot of ways was really like the missionary, was the traveling preacher, was the individual who took his tent and traveled across the world or across the nation preaching the word of God to those who were willing to hear it. I grew up with evangelists and these tent revivals who were guest speakers who would just come
That's
and
what they did, probably,
right. That's all they did. Well, and I mean, they may have a side job, right, where they were carpenters or something like that, but they would travel and rely on whatever donations they got to get them in the gas tank and to travel to the next
Yeah.
place. They were just very passionate, devout individuals, men and women. I've encountered many female evangelists as well when I was young. And so now, though, when I hear evangelical, you're right, it's very politicized and it doesn't have the same definition or experience at all that I had, 30 years ago, 35 years ago as a child. And so for me, now I'm very, I disengage with that term. I have a very difficult time even correlating it with Christianity at all. I feel like it's its own organism, it's its own organization that has a very different purpose and mission on what it's trying to accomplish.
Yeah.
Um, like I said earlier, Christianity for me is about this relationship and this devout, this type of sense of faith that you have in something you can't see, and it's all about free will. Because if I am believing that the Almighty God is Almighty with a capital A, then He has every opportunity to make anybody do anything if He's Almighty. But the fact that He chooses to say, I'm not going to abuse my position of power, and I would much rather you choose me than me force you, that to me sounds like a marriage. That sounds like you're choosing somebody to spend the rest of your life with by choice. And in that choice, you compromise, you negotiate, you grow together through your journey. It's a beautiful thing. Nobody forces you into it. And I'm not talking about arranged marriages.
Yeah.
But to me, that embodies the beauty of the faith, that it's a choice because it's out of love. You don't force love, you allow it to happen. And evangelicalism to me is about the fear.
Yeah. I think it's that. And I guess is another question for you. Like, is this the only religious story? You know what I mean? I think there's my encounter, especially with evangelicals in my faith tradition, was we have the answer. And if you don't agree with this, you're going to hell. That includes everybody on the planet that doesn't agree with this.
Yeah.
So if you're a Buddhist or if you're a Hindu or if you're Muslim, where are you kind of with all that?
Well, I welcome it. I mean, for me, this isn't about my side is the absolute, if you don't buy into this, then you're some evil, terrible person. For me, it's coming together. It's sharing stories and experiences. It's not getting caught up, like I said, in the semantics. It's about focusing on the context. So I can use the words heaven, hell, God,
You said he a little while ago
Messiah.
too, right?
I'm sorry.
You said he too when you were talking about God.
Right, sure, because he, right. It, she, you can gender it, you cannot gender it. And so for me, it's we can use those words when we're talking to people that share the same belief system. But we don't have to use those words. We can say higher power, we can say salvation, we can say love, and we can say turning, not taking offense, instead of saying turning the other cheek, not take offense, try to process through what the individual was trying to convey to you. To me, we get so caught up in language. Language is so powerful. I mean, it is just so powerful, and it can either tip the iceberg or it can keep it balanced. And how we choose to use our words really impacts how not just the next 5 minutes is going to be, but maybe the rest of your life.
Right.
I know scripture talks about the mouth, the tongue is sharper than the sword, and we must be very careful in what we say and how we say it and when we say it. So Buddhism, Muslim, Hindus, Taoists, none of that bothers me. Of course, I don't share the same beliefs they have, but as far as, joining together and having coffee and talking and agreeing and disagreeing, I think that's a beautiful thing.
Yeah. Well, I also think, language is going to be limited if we're talking about the unlimited. Like their language seems to be this really imperfect way, and all we really have to talk about this thing that is beyond language. Right. So it always seems to get real complicated.
Yeah.
You mentioned something a minute ago I also kind of find interesting is that as a kid, the gender thing it's interesting how we get all these kind of subliminal, subtle messages about gender, particularly in the church, or at least I did, where the guys ran the show and the women were in the kitchen. And that's pretty much it. Take care of the kids. And that was argued to be biblical and so forth. But then, I had friends of mine that were charismatic, kind of Church of God and Holiness, and I was seeing women preach, like, was really pretty cool. And I was fascinated by, well, wow, like, it'd be kind of cool to get a woman's perspective on Christianity, God, all these things. I'm kind of fascinated by the fact that certain denominations were, all pretty fundamentalist still, right? Literal interpretation. We're still, in terms of the gender question, oftentimes way ahead of my faith tradition, where women had leadership roles, were seen as having direct contact to God just as men were.
Yeah. Absolutely.
That's huge.
That is huge. That is huge, which created the dilemma for me with the Methodist Church later on that, they had agreed to ordain women after so long, saying
which was a struggle too,
okay, right? Yeah. But then now the Methodist Church is very divided right now because now it's about validating and affirming LGBTQ. And, the pastors of the United Methodist Church currently cannot marry gay people. And so this has created a huge division. And they were the conference, the general conference was supposed to meet, but COVID hit, and there was going to be a huge. They're about to break. So the UMC is about to break off from those who want to keep everything very traditional and heteronormative.
Right.
So we're about to see some changes coming up in the next year or two with the UMC. So. But the Episcopalians went through this.
Yeah, I was fixing to say the Episcopalians have, the Southern Baptists have splintered around everything from race to the role of women. And when I was in college, the United Methodist Church was struggling over the ordination of women. Well, and what's fascinating about that, like, I'm old enough to remember it, but the cool thing is that the people that, born in the last 20 years will just think it's always been this way. And have no historical memory of, no, that was a struggle.
Right.
And, I think it's the Presbyterians are struggling around this, like most of the major denominations are dividing. And we humans really resist change, don't we?
We do. We are creatures of habit.
We really,
So you mess with the routine and
yeah.
we get very agitated.
I think that's always the danger, and I'm certainly guilty of it at times, of being certain about anything. You know,
Yeah.
certainty is not faith, right? But I think I've been at my most dangerous and arrogant and destructive when I was sure that I that I had
Well, you wouldn't be
the
alone, Mark.
answer. Yeah, the answer, you know. So yeah. Well, anything else we should talk about along these lines? It sounds like you're pretty active now, and um, how does that factor into being a social scientist and teaching sociology and being a feminist and having a therapy uh, business service? How does all that work?
Good time management.
and,
So
a, and a parent, right? And a
yeah, right.
spouse, right?
Teaching sociology is not difficult because it's not religious. I mean, we can
Yeah,
talk about religion, but usually, the students you get in there are eager to talk about these things, and
yeah,
we can have some good debate at times. But it's not as hard to talk about this from a social science perspective as it is from a religious perspective. And when you're talking to people who are devout, like for example, in the church that I attend right now, it's very I'm not happy with it, because they are very resistant to affirming LGBTQ,
So you're in a congregation now that's in the midst of this struggle.
correct,
Okay.
correct. I'm in a congregation that has a female pastor too. So
Uh,
it's even more ironic that there would be such a struggle with this,
right.
being the history of the UMC and how, what 35 years ago she would not have been able to be a preacher
Right.
just because of her sex and her gender. So those types of things are very hard for me. It's a lot easier for me to have this conversation in, an intro to social problems class as opposed to my church group that I meet with, so you start thinking about the environments that you're going into and the resistance because they're more conservative in mind. There's
Yeah.
this fear of, well, what's next? Are we going to allow abortion? Are we all going to be okay with that? And it's like, boy, that's the wrong word to use. Let's talk about
Yeah.
women's rights to their body. Like that, we need to rephrase that whole thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And I really want to talk to conservative folks about what pro-life means, right? Because again,
That's,
language is everything.
that's right.
But
Absolutely.
can we go back? And I don't want to pry too much into your congregation, but you just kind of made me think of kind of what intersectionality is about. That, and one of the struggles I've had as kind of an activist over the years is that I'm for the expansion of human rights and inclusion for all marginalized groups. I think that's what I told the most radical text, and I've read them all, and I say this a lot, so I'm sorry if people are tired of hearing it, but the Gospels were the most radical books I've ever read, and I've read a lot of radical writing, and critical theory. I mean, the
Mhm.
idea that I should love people who want to hurt me, or the idea that we're all connected and family, the idea that chasing money is not what you should do with your time, the idea that ethnic groups like Samaritans are family too, and the idea that making peace is the way to move through the world. And um, all that said, one of the things I've just struggled with personally over the years is that, and I said this to Tom, like, I think there's been a lot of confusion about social progress, meaning people now get to do things that the dominant group only got to do. And for me, there's always that danger. And that's kind of the point of this podcast, as someone who's committed much of their life to trying to make a dent in ending the dehumanization of my fellow humans and sister humans. I've done that at times in a dehumanizing way, where I was self-righteous and so forth. And we all run that risk of being oppressive, even if we're in oppressed groups. And I guess I'm asking, is that some of that going on there? for you? And that might be too personal to ask.
No, I think it's a good question. There are moments where there is a conflict, there. And there's one personally, within myself. And there's also one, obviously that I can obviously see going on in front of me. Um, I mean, personally, I have to make sure I'm drawing the line. Am I still in this fight at this church for the right reasons? Am I fighting for inclusion and the support for a place of worship for my brothers and sisters who identify similarly to me? Or am I now doing it because I want to win? And
Yeah.
I'm a very competitive person, Mark. I mean, I grew up playing sports, very competitive female sports. And, you know, I um I have to kind of reflect on that too. That is this because it goes against my faith and my foundation. Competitiveness that's not love. It's okay to go in to have goals and to accomplish things, but let's be careful with how is this turning into a personal endeavor and not one for the greater good. And how am I recognizing not just this fight for myself, but how am I recognizing the battles that others are experiencing in this? And how am I recognizing the battle that my pastor may be experiencing and having to confront such an issue? Because what I'm ultimately asking her to do is to almost get fired. To kind of put her job on the line that she's probably worked her entire life to get to, who's gone through her own struggles as a woman.
Yeah.
And now I'm kind of presenting this new battle with the church on the brink of division. And I mean, how does that make her feel? She has a family, you
Yeah.
know? So kind of thinking, you're right. The gospels are very radical because we even have to love those that may be oppressing us at that very moment, but still trying to say, can you see reason at least in what I'm saying? I've seen too many brothers and sisters walk away from the faith only because they weren't accepted because they were gay or they were trans or they were bi, and it was like, AJ, I can't do this. I'm not gonna submit myself into an institution that's going to tell me that I'm going to some evil, terrible place. And I says, then don't submit yourself to the institution, but don't give up on the faith because the faith is not the institution. That's just what they want you to believe
Yeah.
because they have so much invested into it. Um, and that's a very hard thing because I can't ask them to continue to put themselves through that type of torture. That's very difficult.
Yeah. Do you ever think that's what it means to bear the cross?
Oh,
I'm just wondering, you know what I mean?
that's a good one. Maybe.
Because it seems to me that, and I would say I'm a secular Christian in a way. The story of the Christ is a very political one for me, and it also speaks to what happens when you challenge power, whether it's the religious order of your day in the form of Pharisees and Sadducees, right? Or it's the Roman Empire that's occupied your homeland,
Mm,
you know.
that's a really
And,
good.
and what does it mean to walk through the valley of the shadow of death, and know people that are going to maybe that are on your side, but maybe they're not when it gets hot. And then when people cruelly execute you, and the state puts you to death for sedition, you ask your Father to forgive them because they don't know what they're doing. That's some heavy duty stuff, right? That's
That
like
is.
how so that have you ever read the Cross and the Lynching Tree?
I have not.
James Cone. He's a black theologian, liberation theology. It's a real good book, but makes you really kind of dig into what does it mean to bear crosses and what are those things,
Hmm.
and how do you have compassion when folks are afraid to, like we all are, and have people to take care of and all that. That's what I meant by like when people are being dehumanizing. What's the compassionate way to engage that that's also not dehumanizing? And I have not mastered that at all. That's what I strive to do.
Those are great questions. Yeah, that's a very good question. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we're like an hour and 15 in. Is there anything you want to talk about or any questions you have or?
No, we covered quite a bit, Mark. I appreciate
Yeah,
you
yeah.
come on today. Thank
This has been
you.
great. Well, and maybe we can do it again because I would love to talk about feminist theory, feminist theology, queer theory, a
Sure.
ton of other things. So hopefully we can do this again.
Okay, that sounds good. Thank you,
Well,
Mark.
well, happy holidays. It was a pleasure. Thanks for making the time. Hope you and your family have a great Christmas.